It happened on the courthouse steps, broad daylight, cameras flashing, the nation watching. What began as a routine press conference turned into a moment that would shake the entire justice system. Within seconds, chaos erupted, and the truth, the kind buried beneath decades of silence, started clawing its way to the surface. The headlines told one story, but those who were there knew something far darker had unfolded. And as investigators scrambled for answers, one question echoed louder than all the noise. Was this justice, or the price of uncovering it? For years, Assistant Federal Prosecutor Daniel Reeves had been known as the man who wouldn't look away. His record was spotless, his dedication unwavering, and his latest case was supposed to be his legacy. It began with a string of small-town arrests, statistics that didn't add up, and reports from families who swore their sons had been targeted for the color of their skin. On paper, the system called it law enforcement. But Daniel saw something else. A pattern buried in the data, masked by bureaucracy and silence. The deeper he dug, the stranger it became. Evidence kept disappearing. Whistleblowers backed out at the last minute, and every time he got close to the truth, someone powerful pushed back. But Daniel had already crossed a line, the one between doing his job and doing what was right. Across town, Officer Karen Holt was being hailed as a rising star, disciplined, fearless, and fiercely loyal. She had no idea her name was about to become synonymous with one of the most controversial moments in modern American history. On the morning of the press conference, neither of them knew their paths were about to collide. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, papers fluttering like lost confessions in the wind. The story Daniel was about to reveal could shake the nation, expose a secret operation that had targeted hundreds under the guise of national security. But before he could speak a word, something, or someone, would make sure that truth never came from his lips. In the weeks leading up to that courthouse morning, Daniel Reeves barely slept. Every new file he opened led to another story, another life torn apart. On his office wall, the faces of those wrongfully charged stared back at him. Young men, mostly black and brown, all accused of crimes that seemed copy-pasted from the same script. Each case had been handled by the same task force, signed off by the same officials, and quietly buried when questions arose. He started tracing financial records, internal memos, and cross-agency communications. What he found was chilling. An operation labeled Sentinel. Officially, it was designed to identify domestic threats. In reality, it was targeting activists, immigrants, and anyone who had ever spoken against law enforcement misconduct. The program had been running for years, funded, protected, and hidden in plain sight. Daniel tried to sound the alarm, but his calls were ignored. He sent reports to the Department of Justice. No reply. He reached out to journalists. Their editors shut the story down before it ever saw print. Even colleagues he trusted began to distance themselves. "You're poking a bear that's bigger than you," one of them warned. But Daniel couldn't unsee what he'd found. He couldn't accept that justice could be weaponized this way. Meanwhile, Officer Karen Holt had been pulled into her own storm. She had been reassigned under emergency protocol, given limited information, and instructed to provide courthouse security for a high-risk announcement. But when she reviewed the internal memo, one line stood out. Subject poses a potential national threat. The subject's name, Daniel Reeves. That morning, as Karen suited up, she replayed her training in her mind. She had always trusted her orders, always believed that the badge stood for truth, for protection. But something about this assignment felt wrong. The tone of her commanding officer, the sudden clearance of the courthouse perimeter, the uneasy silence on the radio. As the sun rose over the marble steps, Daniel stood before a wall of cameras, clutching a file that could dismantle careers, maybe even entire institutions. In those pages were years of suppressed reports, encrypted emails, and names that no one dared to speak aloud. He was about to reveal a federal operation that targeted citizens based on race under the guise of national defense. Karen took her position across the courtyard, unaware she was about to become part of the story he had spent his life fighting to expose. And then, the air shifted. Agents appeared in unmarked vehicles, setting up unseen perimeters. A whisper moved through the press crowd. Daniel glanced up, sensing that familiar shadow of danger, that invisible hand that always appeared when power was threatened. He knew they were watching. He just didn't know how far they would go to silence him. The courthouse steps became a blur of noise and confusion. Microphones raised, shutters snapping, voices layered over each other. Daniel stood at the podium, his pulse pounding, eyes fixed on the sea of faces before him. He wasn't supposed to be here. Every warning told him to walk away, but this was the moment he had built toward. The truth, no longer buried beneath red tape or fear. He began to speak, not from his notes but from memory, from the names, the faces, the families who had paid for a system's silence. His words cut through the crowd like wind before a storm. He spoke of Sentinel, the covert program that profiled citizens by race, monitored church groups and community organizers, and funneled fabricated charges through local departments to neutralize potential unrest. He spoke of those who had lost everything, jobs, reputations, freedom, all to protect an illusion of order. As his voice rose, so did the unease around him. Reporters leaned in. Agents at the edges of the crowd exchanged brief, coded glances. Something was happening. A shift too subtle for the public to see, but Daniel felt it in his bones. Across the plaza, Officer Holt watched from behind the security barricade. Her earpiece buzzed with clipped commands, words that didn't sound like protection, but containment. Neutralize the threat. No public interference. The tone chilled her. This wasn't procedure. This was control. Then, in a split second, everything dissolved into chaos. A sudden surge of movement, a sound that silenced every breath, and the crowd scattered in disbelief. Daniel's file hit the ground, pages spilling into the wind, evidence swirling like confessions finally set free. By the time the noise faded, the truth had already escaped. Cameras had captured everything. The fear, the confusion, the undeniable presence of power protecting itself. The story was no longer his to tell. It belonged to the world now. The footage spread faster than any headline could catch it. Within hours, every network replayed the same haunting scene. The confusion, the papers scattering, the face of a man who tried to speak truth to a system built on silence. Officials called it a security failure. But across the nation, people called it something else. A reckoning. Communities who had been ignored for years finally had proof of what they'd always known. Whispers became marches, and those marches turned into movements. Investigations opened, closed, and reopened again under public pressure. Yet even as reports were scrubbed and files sealed, the questions refused to fade. What was Operation Sentinel really designed to protect? And how many lives had already been erased in its shadow? Officer Karen Holt quietly resigned weeks later. She never spoke publicly, but those close to her said she couldn't forget the look in Daniel's eyes, the look of a man who understood that truth can cost more than freedom. For her, the badge had once meant protection. Now it felt like silence. As for Daniel Reeves, his name became both symbol and warning. To some, he was a hero, the man who nearly brought down the largest covert program in modern FBI history. To others, he was a threat, proof that integrity could still shake the most powerful institutions. Years later, the files he uncovered would resurface, reigniting the conversation he started on those courthouse steps. His legacy wasn't in the documents he carried, but in the people who refused to stop asking questions. Because truth doesn't die when silence falls. It waits, buried beneath fear, until someone else is brave enough to dig it back up. So, what do you think? Was Daniel's fight worth the price he paid? Or is justice just another story we tell ourselves to sleep at night? If this story moved you, like, share, and comment below. Your voice might be the one that keeps the next truth from being buried.